Welcome to Redirect Immigration Law and Perspectives, a semi-regular immigration law podcast. My name is Stephen Robbins. I'm flying solo today. My co-host, Matthew Archambault, is on vacation. And so this is me. Yesterday is the day we normally record. I was in court, which is now something I do in person, I think, for the most part. It was actually funny because I decided we'd done some hearings by video teleconference. And I had this family that I was representing yesterday that I just really felt like we needed to be there in person. The judge needed to feel who they were, to feel the things that they were expressing. And we get to court and the judge is appearing by VTC from his house. He's on a big TV monitor in an awkward place, like basically exactly to my right at a 90-degree angle from where I'm sitting facing at the desk in the courtroom. And he's glitching, and I'm sure that we're showing up based on the camera angle he had as a little tiny box on his computer monitor, transmitting virtually zero emotion, zero humanity through his computer screen. So the effect that I was hoping to achieve by going in person, I think ultimately was not achieved. But anyhow, the point of all that was to say that it's been harder to record lately, but we're doing our best. I did want to talk real quick about a couple things. The first thing, this hearing yesterday really got me thinking about, the legal immigration system and the ways that people have to get papers, and the fact that the system is really designed to humiliate people, to degrade them, to criminalize them in a way that is really embarrassing, frankly. Whether or not somebody has criminal history or they've ever been arrested, even whether or not they've entered illegally, even people who enter on visas, if they want green cards, they'll be dragged into interviews. Well, they'll be asked specifically, have you ever been a prostitute or a drug dealer or an illegal gambler? Are you somebody who's been a human trafficker? All these kinds of questions are asked. It hasn't always been this bad. When I started practicing, the green card interviews would often skip those questions because they've already been answered on the form. And, you don't catch a lot of human traffickers by just asking them if they're human traffickers. But there's been this shift that really happened during the Trump administration towards asking every single question on the form, even though it's already been answered and sworn to in writing, and even though they've already completed the biometrics checks and they're well aware that this 65-year-old woman in front of them has zero encounters with law enforcement, but they're still going to ask anyways whether or not she's a member of a gang or whatever. So, it's just something that I've really been thinking about, the way that we bring people into interviews or hearings and we make them cry and we extract the most extreme forms of stress and anxiety and emotion. And then we still sit in judgment over their case, often denying them for reasons that are, arbitrary or capricious. And we've just got to do better than this. And we've got to imagine systems that put the humanity of the person first and foremost. Yeah, I've just been thinking a lot about this lately. And the thing is, even when you win, oftentimes it's at an extreme cost to the respondent or the applicant and their family. Oftentimes people have been through 2, 3, 4, 6 years of removal proceedings with the threat of removal or separation from their family, losing their job, losing their house, all of these things looming over them every day for extended periods of time. And their children, even if they're U.S. citizens, wondering, do I have a future here? Can I really plan for school? Can I really plan for a career if maybe when that hearing comes next year, maybe I'll be left behind to take care of my siblings, or maybe I'll have to relocate to a country where I don't really know the language very well. These are the things that are pressing and weighing on the minds of these children. And it's just such a toxic thing to allow to continue to roll forward year after year. So, people will say, I'm all for legal immigration or expanding legal immigration, but we should stop and think a little bit more about what exactly that means and how we decide to do it. And speaking of legal immigration, there was news this week that there's a framework for a reconciliation bill out of the Senate that supposedly has support from the number of senators that they need, 50 senators, the Democratic senators, straight down partisan lines. And it was reported that there's some immigration stuff in this framework. And I'd heard several months ago that advocates were pushing and some lawmakers were pushing to sort of get immigration reform into a reconciliation bill if they could. I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of what a reconciliation bill is and the filibuster and this and that and Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. All of that is very well covered in other political shows. I tend to listen to the Majority Report with Sam Cedar, who covers these sort of nitty-gritty political questions much better than I could. But essentially, there might be a way to get some good stuff into the reconciliation bill in terms of immigration. I'm actually a little bit happy that I haven't heard that much reporting on it, because I do feel like the more that this can fly under the radar, the better. So actually on the Majority Report on Friday, they had a guest on to talk about this bill, and he listed all the stuff that's in it. And he left out immigration because it is such a huge bill, and he probably just forgot to mention it, which is awesome. Like, please continue to forget to mention it, unless you live in West Virginia or Arizona or one of these states where maybe your senators are on shaky ground. It's a really good idea to be calling them or your representatives to say, look, you need to make sure that this part, the immigration part, stays in the reconciliation bill, because it is something that you could easily imagine being jettisoned at the last minute because it's unpopular or whatever. So make sure you reach out to your reps, your senators, let them know that it's important, that they should definitely fight to keep that stuff in it. But this is kind of the way to go. We've talked about before on this show, comprehensive immigration reform, these big front page of the newspaper efforts to pass immigration reform in the past have always failed, almost by design, it seems. And yet, during the Trump administration, there was a literal amnesty for Liberians that made no news. And it really was just a straight amnesty. If you're from Liberia, you can just apply for a green card. And it was sort of attached to something else. And it was a smallish thing. It wasn't, an overhaul of the whole system. But it became apparent that this is sort of the way, I think, to chip away at some of this stuff and to make sure that you're getting good things done without a lot of the compromise. The immigration reform that almost passed in 2013 was a compromise bill out of the Senate, and it had all kinds of border wall funding and enforcement funding and these kinds of draconian compromises. And so, hopefully the stuff that we can get injected into reconciliation is mostly just good, or all just good, something like that. So that's good news. Now, I told this client who I had court for yesterday, we didn't get a decision. The judge needed the weekend to think about the case. So that's going to be weighing on me and on the client. And I did tell him, if things don't work out, it's possible that this reconciliation bill could be passed with some immigration reform, including a few things that would definitely apply to him. And he literally laughed in my face. And so, I'm cynical. But if you're a farm worker who's lived in this country since 1991 and you've been promised all kinds of things for the last 30 years, you're even more cynical than me, it turns out. So cautiously optimistic, but also with the understanding that there's plenty of time for this to blow up or just be completely jettisoned. So we'll see. The last thing I wanted to mention is there was news yesterday that a judge in Texas essentially ruled that the DACA program should be partially ended. And look, here's the deal. I'm a lawyer. I deal with just immigration. I'm not spending any time on divorces or DUI defense or anything else, just immigration. And I'm confused by what's going on with DACA and the ins and the outs and this and that and this ruling and this injunction. It's very confusing. So we'll try to get somebody on who's smarter than me. But the bottom line is the ruling was essentially that they can still accept or receive new applications, but that they won't be allowed to process them. So they won't be allowed to approve the applications, which is kind of a weird no man's land. I'm not sure how that will affect people's desire to apply. It costs $495 without a lawyer. That's just money that goes to the government. And you've got this judge in Texas saying the government can take your money and your application. It just can't approve it. So the ruling is going to be appealed, it sounds like, by the Biden administration. And so we'll see what happens. And this really leads to a broader conversation about DACA in general. DACA is, again, a program put in place by President Obama in 2012 for people who were brought here when they were younger than 16 years old, who've lived in the U.S. since 2007, who have good moral character, no DUIs. There's a limitation on how many misdemeanors they can have, no felonies, et cetera, et cetera. And they've got to renew their work permit every 2 years. It's $500. Every 2 years, their biometrics are checked. And DACA is this weird thing because on the one hand, it's been life-changing for so many people. It gives them a social security number. It gives them a work permit. And for people who are maybe U.S. citizens and never had to really deal with these things, I don't know that you really understand how monumental that can be. I mean, having a social can be critical for opening a bank account, getting a home loan, obviously finding a job, going to a school that you want to go to, getting student loans. All of these things are facilitated by having these numbers and these documents. And so for so many young people who grew up sort of knowing that I'm going to hit this roadblock, I'm going to be really limited, I've got to live my life sort of hiding who I am, DACA has been really, really critical. On the other hand, it's an insult to those people that their options are so limited. All you get is this work permit. You got to renew it every 2 years. One issue that we're dealing with right now is that renewals are taking 6 months, whereas for the last 4 or 5 years, they've been taking about a month. And so people who applied on time, their work permits are expired. And for many of those people, that means they've lost their job. Imagine you're working at Costco and you've got a pretty good job. You're making $16 an hour. You're working full time. Maybe you get a little OT. You got employer-based insurance. Thanks to that job, you've been able to buy a small house a couple of years ago. You've got a couple of kids, whatever the situation, right? You've got a good little thing going. And all of a sudden you lose your job. Did you lose your job because you're a screw up, because you were late to work, because you stole money from the till? No, you lost your job because immigration couldn't process your work permit renewal on time. Now, if you lose your job and you get your work permit a week later, maybe you get your job back and, a week's wages is a big deal, but you're able to get back on your feet. But what if it takes 4 months for you to get your work permit, even though you applied on time? This is the kind of thing that DACA people have been dealing with the whole entire time that the program has existed. I had a client once apply for her renewal, and she got her card back with some Asian person's face on the card. Anyways, it was not her picture. That's the point. We had to return the card and ask for a replacement. And then immigration misplaced the card. And it was this huge, long deal. She lost her job and, had to, I think, probably move back in with her mom. It was a major disruption to just her basic life functions because of this bureaucratic nonsense. And there's things that immigration could do. They could issue an automatic extension when you apply to renew. They do that with other types of work permits. They haven't done that with DACA. They also don't allow for expedite requests with DACA, which is a really weird, really into the weeds policy decision. I don't know why that is, but with other types of work permits, if you have a humanitarian situation or some sort of emergency, you can call and request that it be expedited. Not with DACA. They won't even listen. So if you call and you say, my DACA is about to expire, I will lose my job, I will lose my house, I will lose my car, they don't care. It doesn't matter. There's no mechanism for them to, basically, they're not allowed to even take an expedite request in such a circumstance. So all of that is to say, DACA has been sort of a big deal and also a slap in the face to people who really need something above and beyond this. So again, going back to reconciliation, one of the things that's rumored to be in this framework is the DREAM Act, which would allow these folks to apply for permanent residency and eventually citizenship. They don't apply straight for citizenship. They don't get to vote tomorrow. There would be probably, depending on how it's structured, some sort of temporary residency and then permanent residency, which they would have to hold for at least 5 years before being eligible to apply for citizenship. They wouldn't get citizenship automatically. You've got to pay, you've got to apply, you've got to qualify. But that's sort of how that works. So there's like a glimmer of hope and also a crushing defeat. And again, this is sort of in the immigration world, we call it a Tuesday, I guess, but that's where we're at. So we appreciate everybody who listens. I posted a thing about my nephew listening to the show now, and that really cheered me up. And then a bunch of other people chimed in saying they like the show. It helps them in their practice, etc. So we appreciate everyone who listens, and we hope that you continue to enjoy it. If you like it, you can subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. You can become a patron at patreon.com/redirect. For every 100 patrons, we take a pro bono case. Here's the deal. We've gotten to 100. We took a pro bono case like 2 or 3 years ago, and we keep dipping below 100 and then going over 100 again. And people are thinking that we should take more and more pro bono cases. And I don't think that's how it works, folks. I hate to say it. We got to get to 200. So share it with your friends or family. And if there's something you want to hear us talk about in particular, let us know. You can find me on Twitter at Yakima Abogado. And we'll talk to you next week, hopefully with somebody who can fill us in a little bit more about this DACA decision. Have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you soon.